Okay, so this time we're really diving into some dark stuff here with Dennis Nilsson.
Yeah, definitely not a light topic.
No, not at all. A serial killer in London, the 70s and 80s. And we're using mainly the Case File podcast, that episode on the Muswell Hill murderer, at least part one of it for this deep dive. Sounds pretty intense.
It is, it gets pretty graphic, so yeah, be warned. But it's fascinating too.
I can imagine.
You know what gets me about Nelson?
Mm.
Just how normal he seemed.
Oh yeah, I've heard that too. I mean,
Not some like shadowy figure.
right.
He had a job, civil servant, even a union rep. Can you believe that?
It's wild. It's like a Jekyll and Hyde thing almost. So how do we even start to unpack someone like that?
Well, the discovery of his crimes is the only place, really.
Okay.
So February 1983, 23 Cranley Gardens, normal apartment building in North London.
Uh-huh.
And tenants had been complaining about blocked drains for weeks. Finally, a plumber shows up, Mike Cather, and he finds, let's just say it was more than just a clog.
Yeah, I think I know where this is going. It wasn't just like some tree roots or something.
No, not tree roots. The podcast, they described this awful smell.
Yeah.
At first, he thought, oh, maybe animal remains, something like that. But then he pulls out a human knuckle.
Wow. Okay, so that's where it all starts to unravel. So who was this guy? Before all that, before the murders and everything, what was he like? Anything in his past point to this darkness?
Let's look at his childhood. Grew up in Scotland. Seems pretty ordinary on the surface, at least. But there are some things that, looking back, take on a whole new meaning.
Yeah.
Like his reaction to his grandfather's death.
What about it?
It's odd. He gets fascinated by death.
Hmm.
Sees it as this better place, almost. Even describes this vision he had of his grandfather's corpse. Most kids, that'd be a nightmare. But Nilsson, it's almost like it had the opposite effect.
It's like death just became like a normal thing for him really early on, almost comfortable.
Yeah, exactly. And then this other thing, when he was 10, strangled a cat. And the way he talks about it later is just chilling. So, matter of fact, no emotion.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so that's pretty disturbing,
I hear-
especially knowing what comes later.
I mean, we can't say for sure that these things made him a serial killer, right?
Right.
But they definitely give us a glimpse into how his mind was working, even back then.
Yeah.
And then there's his sexuality, realizes he's attracted to men, but this is the 70s, right? So much shame and homophobia around that.
Yeah. Yeah. Hard to even imagine what that must have been like for him back then.
Right, so you've got this internal conflict, this possible shame he's carrying. It's all there in the background. Then he joins the army, later the police force.
Okay, so how does that fit in? How does that like shape him?
Army life gave him discipline, structure, but it also exposed him to violence, death. It just became more and more normal to him.
Oh.
And that's when we see these fantasies start. Fantasies about unconscious or dead men.
The podcast mentions that, yeah.
Like he would pretend to pass out drunk, hoping to, be touched by other men. It's really creepy and kind of sad too.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Like he couldn't deal with actual intimacy.
Yeah.
So he went for these situations where there was no consent.
It's all about control for him, even then. And it gets worse.
Yeah.
This incident on a train with a passed out private, he ends up making the guy injure himself on purpose.
Oh gosh.
He moves from fantasies to actually hurting people, then the police force. He's in the records department, sees all these photos of crime scenes, dead bodies, and it's like he doesn't even react.
That's really unsettling. Like he's become desensitized to it all.
Exactly. And remember the homophobia we talked about. He saw that in the army, in the police. All this hypocrisy, it must have just fueled his anger and isolation.
Makes sense. So we've got this buildup, exposure to death, these disturbing fantasies,
Yeah.
the need for control, and all this societal pressure, the homophobia he's dealing with. Is that what leads to the first murder?
Well, his relationship with David Galachon, that's a big turning point. They lived together at 95 Melrose Avenue. For a while, it seemed like, maybe he could have a normal life. They had pets, a garden.
A garden? It's weird to think of a serial killer like tending to flowers and stuff.
Right. But their relationship was falling apart. Nilsson was very controlling, and Galachon started having affairs.
So there's a lot of turmoil, a lot of emotional stuff going on for Nelson at this point.
Absolutely. And then he meets Stephen Holmes, New Year's Eve at a pub.
Sure.
Just a casual encounter at first, but it quickly turns dark. Nilsson actually wrote about it later. He said, I'm quoting here, "I wanted him to stay with me over the new year, whether he wanted to or not."
Oh, wow. That's chilling. You can just hear that need for control in his words.
Exactly. And then it happens. He strangles Holmes with a tie. And then the cleaning starts. The scrubbing, the water bucket, the whole ordeal of hiding the body under the floorboards.
The podcast describes it all in such detail. It's hard to listen to.
It's like you're right there with him, seeing it all happen. And with that first murder, the cycle begins.
And 95 Melrose Avenue becomes a place of unspeakable horrors.
And it's at Melrose Avenue where we see this pattern with Nilsson, this really creepy pattern.
Oh.
Like, he thought if he just, cleaned everything up perfectly, it'll just go away.
Yeah, right. Like scrubbing away a murder. That's not going to happen.
No, not at all. And it gets worse. Over the next 4 years, he kills 12 more people there.
12. God, that's hard to even comprehend. Who were these victims? Were they all like similar to Stephen Holmes, the first one?
There were some similarities, yeah. A lot of them were young guys, kind of struggling, maybe homeless or just lost.
Yeah.
London back then, the 70s, 80s, especially the gay scene, it was a whole different world. A lot of these young men came to the city looking for acceptance, but they ended up alone and vulnerable.
So he was preying on that vulnerability.
Exactly. Met them at pubs, on the street, often when they were drunk or high, offered them food, a place to stay. He seemed like this nice guy, someone who could help.
Classic predator move. Gain their trust and then bam.
That's awful.
Yeah.
These guys, a lot of them had already been let down by society, They were just grateful for the attention, no idea what was coming.
Are there any cases from this time at Melrose that really stick out, like especially heartbreaking, or that show how he operated?
Yeah, there's John Howlett, 23-year-old student. He was having money trouble, so he jumped at the chance for a free meal and a place to sleep.
There's that offer of food again. It's like a lure.
Right. So Howlett's at the flat, Nilsson gets him drunk, and then strangles him while he's sleeping.
God.
But what's really messed up is what he does next. He keeps the body in the bathtub for days, bathing it, dressing it.
It's like he's trying to pretend death didn't happen, or like he wanted a companion or something. It's really creepy.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's about control. He couldn't control his own life, his urges, but he could control these victims, even in death.
And this happens with other victims, too.
Yeah. Graham Allen, 19 years old, ran away from home, same thing, strangled, then kept the body for weeks. Nilsson even tried to use like household chemicals to preserve it. He would talk to the bodies, dress them up, position them, like he was creating these scenes, these little plays, but with dead people.
Ugh, it's horrific. But here's the thing, right? He's still living a normal life on the outside. He's going to work. He's a union rep.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's like he had these two separate worlds in his head, and he never let them mix. But people at work were starting to notice. He was getting more volatile, angry.
So how does it all end? How do they finally catch him?
It's kind of ironic, actually. Something totally ordinary, something most people wouldn't even think twice about.
What was it?
Blocked drains.
You're kidding? Blocked drains.
I know, right? Sounds crazy considering all the horrible stuff he did.
Yeah.
But remember, those remains the plumber found.
Right, the human knuckle, that's when it all started coming out.
Well, those remains, and the fact that the drains at his new place, 23 Cranley Gardens, were constantly getting clogged, it raised some red flags. This time, the police were paying attention.
So they went back to Cranley Gardens.
Yeah. And the smell hit them right away. This awful stench, it was all over the building.
And imagine being a tenant there, living with that, and not knowing what it was.
Yeah, pretty terrifying thought. But this time, they knew what they were dealing with. They confronted Nilsson, and he started talking. Confessions, interviews, it blew the whole thing wide open.
So that's it. The mask comes off. The game's over.
Yep. And in those confessions, we get this look inside the mind of a serial killer. It's fascinating and disturbing all at the same time.
It's got to be a weird feeling, right? Like when you're finally caught after all that, what was going through his head?
Well, the detective in charge, DCI Peter J., he said Nilsson was totally calm. Cooperative even, almost like he was glad it was over, God, that's even creepier, to be honest.
No.
Like all those horrible things, and he's just like nonchalant about it. Shows how detached he was.
Detached, yeah, that's the word for it. When they asked him about the smell, the one coming from his flat, Nilsson he points to a cupboard and says, in there, some human remains.
Like it was nothing. Just, oh yeah, that's where I keep the bodies. It's insane.
That's the thing with Nilsson. It's what makes him so disturbing. No real remorse, not that anyone could tell. And in that cupboard, the remains of several victims, just stuffed in bags, already decomposing.
Ugh. Must have been a nightmare for those officers. The smell alone, I can't even imagine.
It was gruesome, no doubt. But it was what they needed to finally nail him. So they arrest him, bring him in for questioning.
So did he confess? Did he say why he did all of it?
Nilsen, he was surprisingly open about it all, confessed to killing at least 15 young men, gave them all these details, how he did it, even some of his reasons.
And did he, show any remorse, like any regret for what he did to those people, their families? That's the thing that still gets to people, even the experts. There's no real remorse, not in his words anyway. No empathy either. He talked about them like they were objects, the bodies, he called them, or the subjects, like they were part of some experiment.
It goes back to that control thing, doesn't it? Like he was playing God with these people's lives.
Yeah, and even after they were dead, he was still controlling them, bathing them, dressing them up, even talking to them. It was all part of this fantasy he had, this really twisted world where he was in charge.
So was he like mentally ill? Or just evil, plain and simple?
Tough question. Some think he had a personality disorder, maybe even psychopathy. That doesn't excuse it, of course. But it does help us understand why he lacked empathy, why he was so manipulative, so out of touch with reality.
So not just a monster then. There was a person in there somewhere, damaged though he was.
We can't forget that, can we? Even people who do the worst things, they were once kids. Their experiences, good and bad, they shape who they become. It doesn't excuse anything, but it helps us make sense of it a little bit anyway.
What happened after they arrested him? Did he go to trial?
Oh yeah, big media circus, that trial. 6 counts of murder, 2 of attempted murder. They had all this evidence. His confessions, the stuff they found at his flats. It was brutal hearing it all, especially for the families of the victims.
No, I can't imagine. So guilty.
Guilty on all counts. Life in prison. He died there 2018, 72 years old.
It's a tough story to hear, but important, I think. We have to look at these things no matter how dark they are.
I agree. If we can understand why people like Nilsen do what they do, maybe, just maybe, we can stop it from happening again.
That's a good thought. It makes you think. How can we spot these kinds of things before it's too late? Especially when someone seems so normal on the outside.
Big question. Maybe it starts with looking out for each other, you know, being aware of who might be vulnerable in our communities, building a world where people feel safe, supported.
I like that. It's been a heavy deep dive. Thanks for walking me through it. Definitely given me a lot to think about.
Glad to do it. Until next time.